Hi, this is Wilfredo Hernandez and
Rebeca Centeno.
with the LGBTQ New Americans Oral History Project. So maybe we can start off with, you can tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up in India, which is always my sort of short answer to a very long question. My parents moved around a lot, and so in India they moved, I went to boarding school, and so I was in many different cities, and every time sort of came home from vacation, went to a different city in India. And I was there till I was 18, but sort of all over the country. Mm-hmm.
And what was that like for you? Can you tell us a little bit about what traveling around the country at such a young age is like?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of unpopular opinions, or I find is unpopular, is that I just didn't love like the educational institutions I was in. I think being chubby and awkward and having big glasses and just sort of having really not a lot of social skills, and then being far away from your parents and boarding school, it doesn't make for the best combination of things. But you know, I think it was helpful in that it forced me to be independent at a really young age, and also try to figure out community and folks who had my back in order to navigate situations where ordinarily folks would sort of reach for their parents. One of the things I, now looking back, also realize is that moving around as much as we did, I don't speak my native language as well as I would want to. I speak it as like with an accent and with somebody who's sort of lived outside the state for a very long time. I can't read and write in it. I think I failed the 3 exams I had in it in school, so that definitely feels like a loss. But you know, I think there were some good things, and I think for my parents, it was a way to ensure that we had a stable education and community while they were sort of relocating every few years.
Mm. So you talked a little bit about learning some independence at a young age. What did that look like, independence?
To start with, I think it looked like, you know, learning how to tie my shoelaces better. But I think it felt like problem solving, or like being a little bit more creative with the solutions to issues. I think when I was 9, I wrote my parents a letter, and the sort of thesis of the letter was my shampoo bottle broke, and that was sort of all of it, right? Like it broke, I didn't know what to do, I didn't know where to get shampoo from, then the consequence on showers, and but you know, I think you sort of reach around for who's around you and who else is invested in your crisis, and can help get you some measure of comfort in that moment. And then I think the older I got, it also meant that I got to live different lives, right? Like I sort of went away for 8 months of the year and was in boarding school and studied certain things and read certain things and spoke with certain people. And then my parents got like a letter every month, and a really edited version of what that life looked like. But then there was this life with my parents and all of our relatives and all of the things that brought me comfort when I was around them. But the two sort of functioned in parallel. And they only intersected when I wanted them to, or when I got in trouble. But otherwise, when I wanted them to, which I think was quite heady, I think, when you're young.
Mm. And so in school, what was your favorite subjects to study?
English. Yeah, I was like, I don't know if it's the right brain or the left brain. I'm bad at the math side of my brain and the science side of my brain.
Me too.
What is funny is that my dad's worked in a bank his entire life, and my mom has been a chartered accountant her entire life, which is similar to CPA here. So they're both math people. They have done math for work for like several decades. And my sister and I have both sort of not wanted that. So English, I liked French. I did not like sports, you know, the usual.
So by the time you kind of completed your studies, and did you advance through college or university?
Yeah, so I, after the 10th standard, I got a scholarship to United World College, which is a last 2 years of high school, specialized high school that does the International Baccalaureate. At the time there were 12 around the world, now there's many more. But they were started by Kurt Hahn after World War II, and the whole idea was that if people knew each other, they wouldn't try to kill each other in wars. We can all debate the logic of that. But so I did that for 2 years. That was my last 2 years of high school. So after, there was sort of a natural path where the kids who came from Europe went back to Europe, and everybody else tried to get into school in the US. And so I went to undergrad in Maine. That was sort of my pathway, and a rich white American man paid for all of it, so that was nice. I feel very lucky. I should use better terms for him, but in my mind, when I was 18, that is all I knew about him.
Sure. So what was that? What was that like at 18? So you chose to come to school in the U.S. And obviously you came. I don't want to make the assumption, but did you have a support network in place? Did you have anyone here in Maine that you knew, or?
Yeah, so what was weird for me, as opposed to a lot of the other Indian folks in my cohort, was that in 1987, so before I was a reality, my dad's brother applied for green cards for all of his siblings. And 18 years later, so when I was sort of poised, which is actually truly indicative of immigration visa processing times for Indians, because we're on the slow roll. But when I was coming to the US, it was also the time that I had an immigrant visa, and so I immigrated. And so I came with my dad, because he was the only, my parents had already sort of been doing this green card, they'd already done the big trip. And so they felt like it was important for me to have somebody else come with me. So my dad flew with me, and we flew to Philadelphia, where his sister, who had also at that time had become an immigrant, and her husband lived. And so that was sort of the process. And so there was a support. It was weird. I think in 1987, my dad's siblings were young and wild and excited about the future. And when the visa came through, they'd sort of lived a lifetime, right? They had kids, they had investments in India, not financial investments, but family and jobs and all this stuff. And so what they then ended up doing is they didn't want to give up the immigrant visa because it felt like such a big opportunity, but they also had jobs and all this stuff in India. And so they came, and some of them stayed because they wanted to stay the 5 years and sort of become citizens. And some of them, like my parents, were sort of navigating how to close things down in India and move. And so when we came to Philadelphia, we stayed for a little bit with my dad's sister and her husband, who had been professors in India, and then were at that time working on a factory line. So sort of doing, having jobs and sort of keeping the rolls running so that they could get to that 5-year period.
Wow.
Who is the rich white man that paid for your college? Can he pay for my student loans?
Yes. He went to a UWC, he went to a United World College, and he picked certain colleges in the US and said, if you are a student from a United World College and you get in, I will pay the difference between what the school is able to do and how much money you need. So it was very much sort of a movement in the network. But I think it was unimaginably generous, because it also meant that then the schools would support you with stipend to fly home the first summer and things that were really helpful. But I don't know, the jury's still out on what else he's doing, but I know he's doing a lot, so who knows, student loans might be the next thing.
I'll look into it.
Yes.
It seems like a great opportunity at such a young age. So by the time you came to study at school in Maine, what were your goals? What were you studying at that point? What did you want to do?
Yeah, I didn't know. And so that's a big part of the reason I did this for school, because in India, right after high school, well, in the last 2 years of high school, you have to specialize what stream of study you're going to do. So you have to pick commerce or science or humanities. And then in undergrad, you're already sort of building a career, right? So you're an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, but you do that right out of high school. And because I didn't know, and I'd done the IB, which was very sort of different from the Indian streamlined system, liberal arts seemed like, yep, sure, I'll do that. And so I think when I came, beyond I will graduate and have a degree and hopefully be able to take a lot of fun subjects, I didn't really have a, here's what I'm headed to.
Sure. So what were some of your favorite subjects in college?
So I majored in French. I actually spent my first semester abroad. So I was in France for the first 6 months of undergrad. And so I came back and had enough, like it sort of made sense to continue studying French. And I realized once I encountered Maine that I wanted to spend as little time as possible in Maine. And if you're a language major, you can also spend all of your junior year abroad. So it was a combination of things, but yeah, so I studied French, that's the language I majored in. And then I took, I think in my senior year, like drama and improv and some fun things, but also had to, do badly in chemistry and learn a lot about French cinema. So it's a weird combination of things, but yeah, French is what I graduated knowing.
You mentioned when you were in school, I think in India, that you would send kind of edited letters to your parents. Can you talk about that and maybe why they were edited and how they were edited?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start with, they were edited by other people. Like when we were really young, I think like 9 through 12, somebody else read your letters. And sort of like, if your letter said, woe is me, the world is falling apart, I hate boarding school, high chance that somebody would work with you to write a different letter. And also I think when we were 9, we didn't know how to write letters home. And so we had letter writing time, and somebody would help us with the first paragraph of the letter. So we all had these weird beginnings to our letters. I think my parents, the first one, it said like, as the first few months is swooshing by and I can see holidays round the corner, and they were like, you're 9, like what are these words? And so I think it was really clear. I think my sister did a lot of the same schooling that I did. Her first letter said, dear mother and father, which neither of us call our parents mother and father, and they're like, great, here are some lies that will follow. And then I think the older we got, that became less true. Like I think the first 3 years there was this sort of additional layer, but not so much after that. But I think then we just got in the habit of, here's what you talk to your parents about, right? And there were sometimes, a lot of my complaints were about food and how I didn't have access to enough of it, and I didn't like what I had access to, like all that stuff. But I think at some point it also became less interest. Like I think there was just this life of, here are my friends, here's all the gossip we talk about, here's this and that, and like it just, by the time it got to letter writing time, not all of that made it in. I think it was more like, here are my grades, things are good, send food, come visit, So I think it was a combination of necessity at the beginning and then just sort of getting acculturated to a particular kind of communication when writing from school.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think looking back now, I feel like it also set me up for living the life I do now. My parents still live in India, and I think partly a lot of adulthood has been struggling against that and not like sort of minimizing the details to a level where the stuff I'm communicating about is not interesting. But at the same time, I'm like able to walk the world as a queer person here, and so be in community with folks in a different way than I would at home. And I think it's also been helpful to not have to sort of share space in the same way if I don't want to.
So you mentioned queer as an identifier. Is that how you identify?
Yes.
Queer? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you? What the term queer means to you?
Yeah, I think when I was 19 and first thinking, I might be interested in women, I think there was a while where I was like, what am I, right? And I also dated men, and it just felt like there needs to be an answer, and the answer needs to be now, and then you need to like be slotted into your social life. And so I think for a long time I just didn't identify any sort of way. I think mostly people didn't ask the question and I didn't answer it. And I think I started to identify as queer more sort of strongly when I moved back to India and started working with feminist nonprofits. And I was like, here's some people I don't want speaking for me, and here's why. And then more when I moved to New York. So I moved to New York in 2011 after spending a couple of years in India, and moved into a queer people of color house and only hung out with queer people of color and was in a lot of organizing spaces. And then I think it became more of a militant, but more of a political identifier, right? So I think it was then that I started to think about being queer not just as my sexual orientation, but also as a way of seeing the world, and how I understood structures and the things that I questioned, right? And I think sort of starting with things like monogamy and ending with things like state-sanctioned ideologies. But I think marrying the two and really seeing my place in the world and the people that I was dating and interested in as this political, and thinking about that in a lot broader context. And I know that some people who are straight identified otherwise will identify as queer because their politics are queer, and I'm against that. Which sometimes I just want to say. I'm like, no, you're not queer, but thank you for the solidarity from the outside.
Yeah, thank you for opening that up. You mentioned working for some feminist nonprofits. Mm-hmm. So did you kind of start to come to terms with the queer identity, or maybe not around like that specific language, but with your identity and wants and desires and views in college and post-college?
Yeah, I think definitely in college and post-college. I think I've had a lot of sort of back and forth, and for a long time saw my sexual orientation as contextual, like when I was in places that felt primarily straight, like India. I think I was like more interested in men and tended to date men, and when I was in places that felt like less so, tended to be interested in date women. And so I think for some time I was like, well, I am a problem, right? Like I should have an identity that's not so dependent on my context. And so in India, I think there's both and. I think there was the sort of, I was done with college and I identified some sort of way in college, but mostly just to myself. And then feeling like, oh, but this is my history and I'm still trying to come to terms with it. But yeah, so I think it was sort of, I think the sort of, hello, I'm Sarah and I'm a queer person and here are my other identifiers, more when I moved to New York. But I think it sort of percolated starting in college.
Yeah, it's interesting how you talk about sexual orientation and context.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell us a little bit about what the climate is like in India, what the context is,
Mm-hmm.
Navigating that space, whether yourself or people you knew or worked with in the work you were doing, what that's like?
Absolutely. I think this is a question that always makes me a little nervous because I'm like trying to straddle like native informant, right? And then also like confirming sometimes like Americans' views of any other country that's not their own. Sure. But I think what was really weird is that I actually know a lot of out queer people in India, like a lot of out queer women. And a lot of them are in these feminist organizing spaces and have partners and, sort of occupy public spaces as queer. But that I think I was in India right after Section 377, which is British era sodomy law, had been read down. Okay, so India inherited a lot of problematic laws and views from the Brits, and I like to remind people of that because I'm like, this came from the white people, and we should all remember that. But Section 377 is a sodomy law and has been used in India for a variety of things. One, to actually criminalize sodomy, but also to address pedophilia and oftentimes, as was the case I think in the early 90s, also to harass people who were doing safe sex education. So if someone was distributing condoms, they would sort of use Section 377 to harass them or in some cases jail them. And so as a result of a lot of activism, very public from a lot of people, there was a court case against Section 377 essentially asking that it be read to remove consensual adult relationships from the reading of the law. So sort of, we recognize that the law is being used to talk about pedophilia and certain other things that we want to continue criminalizing, but we want to remove from that any sort of consensual homosexual activity. And so in the time that I was in India, the Delhi High Court had agreed with that sort of advocacy and had said, yep, we're reading it down to decriminalize homosexuality. And that was the sort of pretty time of life when I was in India. Since then, the Supreme Court has reversed that, and there's now ongoing advocacy, and I'm not always up to date on it. But that was sort of the broad framework. And so I think I knew a lot more out people and like organizations that work specifically with queer populations and trans populations, because that was the national context, but also people who had been doing the work for decades felt like they could be out in the open talking about the work. So since then, there's, the Congress government that was in power at the time changed. There's now a prime minister in India who I don't support, and who is very, very supportive of Trump, and they, see eye to eye on many things. And it's also, in the past few years, has been a Hindu nationalist uprising in India. So a lot of sort of India belongs to Hindus. My family's not Hindu, so there's sort of multiple minority histories to navigate. So that's sort of the broader political context. I'm sure I'm missing many details, but all that doesn't matter because my family's pretty homophobic. And so, I don't think so much because and I don't know that because I had a gay relative and everybody's mean to them, or I have a gay relative and everybody wanted their blood. I just knew that growing up, right? Like, it was never a thing that anybody talked about. I think at the margins, there's always been some jokes about but honestly, nobody ever talked about queer folks in any sort of light. Trans people have always occupied public space in India, and so you see them. There's certain rules around interacting with trans folks who are on the street and asking for money, and I've navigated space like that, but no one in my extended family has ever acknowledged that there is such a thing as being homosexual, right? And so I just sort of knew that would be not okay. And then my sister, who's also queer, 2 for 2, came out to my mother, and it was met with a really terrible reaction. So I think I just had a lot of clues of don't be queer in public space in India, and also don't be queer with your family in India, because it won't be received well on any level.
Growing up with a queer sibling, or what is that like?
So I didn't grow up with a queer sibling, which is weird. I think my sister came out to my mom when she was in undergrad at Wellesley, and so we did the exact same. Shelby Davis also funded her education, and so I didn't experience her as a queer sibling. I think because when we were home, she was either, I should ask her about this. I don't think she was out, or we didn't talk about relationships, or we talked about a man she was interested in. But it was actually a few years later that she told me that she had come out to my mother and it had gone badly. I don't even think it was anywhere within the time frame that it happened. And I think, and then after, so I wasn't really aware of her relationships with other women in undergrad, and I think by the time I knew she was queer, we might have both identified that way or talked about it. So I think, yeah, it wasn't the sort of growing up with queer sibling experience, but I do think that there was some legacy and history there in terms of the relationships she tried to navigate and could inform me about, but a little while later.
Sure. Are you out to your family as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Now, to my parents, and so my mom, I think a few years ago, discovered that my partner at the time, who I'd been talking about and she was excited to meet, is trans. And so I think she she discovered this on the internet and freaked out, right? And there's just and my sister, she was staying with my sister at the time, my sister navigated a lot of that for me and was like, don't pick up the phone. Like, you know, like this is a bad time to talk. And things sort of simmered, I think, because my mom realized that fighting me about it was just gonna make me dig my heels in more. But also I think she was like, well, this is a relationship and you're figuring things out, but you'll get married to a man eventually and it'll be okay, right? Or at least that's my interpretation of what she thought. And my dad was sort of out of the conversation entirely. And so, you know, my mom, I talked to a little bit about like, oh, my partner's having this issue, or, you know, here's what we did this weekend. And actually when my dad came to visit New York, I had my partner meet him, but as a friend. Which now looking back and like, I think, you know, we were very like queer POC in New York, so did a lot of processing before and after, but I still feel like a little unsure of whether that was a good decision, and whether that was like kind to my partner and my dad. But I think I was just triaging a situation that felt really impossible to me, and I was like, oh, like at least this way they meet each other, which, you know, then I thought everything is ending and we need to do this now. But I came, so fast forward a little while and, you know, my partner and I broke up. My mom was like, everything's fine. And then we had this interim phase for the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years where my parents were like, we're gonna find you a husband. And this works, you know, less like people think it works in India and more like a Tinder for adults. Well, not Tinder, I guess, that's weird. But like a dating service, right? So they're like, our friend has a son, he's great, he's probably has a good job and all that, et cetera, et cetera. Why don't you guys chat? And I was like, sure. And I think that's like something that, like, I think I've always also been interested in men, right? And I think I've navigated that in a variety of ways in the spaces that I've been in New York. But I think there was also an aspect of, this feels easy and like it'll be okay, right? Like this person's family and my parents will know each other. I think is also like, one of the things I've had trouble with living here is how much I miss home and like Indian people and food and customs and people who know my people. And so I was like, you know what? He has a job at Google, probably makes a lot of money, we'll be friends, it'll be great. And so I talked to a lot of these people and, you know, I'm sure will be great husbands to somebody who's not me. But at some point I was like, oh, this feels boring, right? Like we're not gonna have the same politics, and why discover that later? I don't want a kid immediately, and several of the people were like, tomorrow, children. And so, you know, I kept going back to my parents with like, yeah, I talked to him, you know. And so that was sort of our back and forth. And last May, in 2017, I turned 30. I took my parents on a trip and we had a good time. And after the trip, they went back to India and then wrote me an email saying, hey, on the internet, there's things that say you're queer. Or like gay things. I can't remember how they phrased it, but they were like, can you edit this stuff because it's making like it's hindering our like man search process, because what if they like Google you and find that, you know, this is who you are. And I think at that point I was like, oh, I'm kind of done. So I responded, I was like, hey, there's queer stuff about me on the internet because I'm queer. You know, I'm not gonna edit it, and you know, I'm happy to sort of chat more. And, you know, use all this sort of, you know, trademark, it gets better language of like, I'm still the same person, whatever else. And then we just had, for a few months last year, a weird back and forth, right? Like, I think where my parents were trying to argue, I can't even remember what your original question was. I'm really sorry. Because I'm like, yeah, I'm telling you the story.
No, this is the work.
But yeah, so we just had a weird back and forth, right? Where my parents were trying to have this like intellectual argument with me about something that was not, I was like, sure, let's engage. But also not really an argument, right? My dad was like, well, we don't think you're queer because you've been interested in men before. And I was like, uh-huh. And then they were like, well, okay, but maybe you could just choose that instead, you know, like that would be fine and also cool. And so it was just a weird mix of, we love you and we're going to be here for you. And, you know, on one hand, that's really great because I think they never there was never any part of that communication that was like, now go away forever, we don't want to talk to you. But it was like, we love you, and also come be the kid we want you to be right now, right? And also you're 30, and if you're not married now, when will you be married? And then you'll be alone forever, and everybody else has kids, and you won't have kids, and your friends will leave you, which is the narrative that a lot of parents, I feel like, give their kids. They're like, you have friends now, but you're not gonna have them forever. And so, you know, we had this back and forth, and I think it was really hurtful and hard. And I'm dating somebody, and I was dating this person at the time, and, you know, she comes from a very like, yay, you're gay, like, let's introduce you to everybody we know family. And so I think there was a lot of her trying to figure out how to be supportive and not judgmental, but also being like, hey, I don't think this is okay, but it seems like you're cool with it. And I was like, yep, sure, I'll write an email, it'll be fine. So we did that for a few months, and then my parents were coming to New Jersey to visit. They were in Atlanta at the time, helping with my niece, and they were like, you know, I was like, let's all have lunch, and they were like, okay. And they're like, but just so we're clear, we're just meeting her as your friend. And I was like, no. And so, you know, we had that back and forth, and I think we landed in a place where it's like, we love you, and sure, we'll meet this person, and okay, fine. But also we're kind of hoping that this is not it, right? Like that this is not going to be forever. And then, you know, my dad got really ill. And so I think it's been, oh, right, your question was, are you out to your parents? So that was sort of the process. And I feel really grateful because my dad has a terminal illness, and I feel really grateful that we had all of this back and forth before that, right? And that our story is not that he got diagnosed and then he was like, it's okay, but more that we just engaged with all of the nuts and bolts and thoughts and feelings and emotions. And also, now that he's ill, he's invested in this relationship, right? And he's met my girlfriend, and he was like, okay, like, you know, he gave her very high praise, which was that she didn't get lost once while driving. And he asked about her now. And so I think it's ended in a good place, but, you know, definitely started with all of the work my sister did in the early 2000s and sort of doing it in this iterative way, where I'm still not sure that this is what my parents want, and I don't know if it'll ever be exactly what they dreamed of, but I think they found a way to find peace with it, and eventually advocate for me.
Do you feel like coming from a culture where maybe that's not as widely accepted? I don't know, but do you feel like that's kind of big for your parents to be accepted? It sounds like maybe they've come around.
Yeah, I think for sure. I think it's like whatever NIMBYism is for queer people, right? Like, so the weird thing about my parents is that they've met all my sister's queer friends, and they've met my gender non-conforming friends, and they'll try to remember pronouns and ask about partners. And I think my mom read the autobiography of Malcolm X, you know, like, so they're the NIMBY crew for queerness, right? They're, if it's not my kids. But I think when it was their kid, I think then they were like, yes, like, nobody in our family talks about queerness. We know that they're not going to be on board. Like, how are we going to navigate all of these multiple layers of, it's essentially like, what will people think, right? But like, in so many layers, in so many ways, all the time. And I think for them also, I think in the early days, my mom was also like, you know, you live in the US and you'll be fine, but we're here with all these people who don't even see queerness in their worldview, right? And there's this aspect of like, you're not being considerate of the cultural dynamics that we have to navigate. So for sure, I think it definitely played a part. And that, you know, change is happening, but at the margins and not necessarily in the spaces that they occupy.
So that sentiment about you being in the U.S. and you'll be fine, how does that resonate with you now that you are in the U.S.? Do you know?
Yeah.
In this in this specific moment in time? How does that play for you?
I think it's a little true, right? I mean, I know that, we have a central federal administration that is, I'll not say more words, but, I don't think that I've felt my sort of daily reality impacted by that, and that has a lot to do with all of the mitigating identities I have, right? I have class privilege, and I'm South Asian, and like sort of walk the world as a femme person, and all of these things that I think allow me to coast a little bit. And so I think there are ways in which I'm fine, and I wouldn't be as fine in India, or I couldn't be as out, or I couldn't hold my girlfriend's hand and walk down the street. So I think that's true. And also I think there's a lot of loss in finding spaces that you're able to be yourself in so far from home, right? And I think that a lot of being fine involves being far away from extended family and my parents, and not being able to, like, knowing that I won't be able to navigate those spaces in the way that I am able to here. So I think she's right, and also I feel like it's a little bit glib to ignore the impact that immigration has on a lot of the other parts of my identity that I therefore have to forego in order to be comfortable being queer in public space.
Can you talk about what some of those are? Like you mentioned missing home, being away from, friends and family, or maybe people that are more, I don't know, maybe you miss your culture, maybe you miss being around people who are...
Yeah, I think what's weird about like immigrating in the way that I did is that I didn't immigrate for anything, right? Like I didn't immigrate for economic opportunity, or because I was fleeing persecution, or I'm not leaving something, or at least at 18 I wasn't escaping anything, right? And so I think it's this weird experience where I'm like, actually home's great, right? Like I think when you watch all the like narratives about immigration, and people are like, all of these people didn't have a choice, and that's true for so many people. And also there's a lot of us, right? Like there's a lot of people who moved here with a green card or a relative or a passport, and we're sort of also here, right? And so I think that like it's been hard to find, I think for me specifically in New York, I don't know a lot of people who've had my experience, and that's bad because it means a lot of people didn't have a comfortable experience living here. But also I don't know a lot of Malayalis who live here, and I don't know people who eat the food that I grew up eating, and people who grew up Syrian Orthodox Christian. Like I'm non-practicing, but it's such a weird cultural identity, and so I think, and mostly I grew up in a country where everyone looked like me, right? Like and so I think moving here and experiencing racism and experiencing xenophobia and other kinds of bigotry, I'm sometimes like, why did I choose this? Like I'm not, like home is great. Like there's so many benefits to home outside of like family comforts. I mean, there's somebody who makes food in the apartment, right? Like there's a car that I can have access to. Like, I don't know, so I think it's this weird thing about like middle class or upper class migration, where not fleeing from something means that you always have a choice, and every day you wake up with the choice that you made. And so I think there's this phrase in Hindi, which is not my native language, even though so many people think it is, that is like dhobi ka kutta na ghar ka na ghar ka, which like roughly translates to the washerman's dog doesn't belong to the house or the fields, which is, the point is you sort of stop belonging somewhere, right? Like I think because I am the way I am, I see this as a grand tragedy, but not everybody does. But like I grew up with a lot of things that are familiar to me that aren't here. And there's a lot of things that I'm able to do work being queer in public that I couldn't do at home. But I think there's no comfort in making the right choice, right? I think I'm making like pragmatic choices, but especially now with my dad being sick, I'm just like, what am I doing? You know, like I'm going to a job and making project plans, like. So yeah, so I think it is homesickness, but it's also all of the trade-offs that feel like trade-offs because I can choose, and I feel like there's no right choice, and so there's always some discomfort with the things that I can't fit it all into the same bucket.
It's complex.
Yeah.
So, a common thread line through these interviews also is a missing of culture, a missing of like connecting. How do you find ways to connect to what you miss or to what is part of you?
So when I moved to New York in 2011, I moved to Jackson Heights. And I think a lot of people thought it was a weird decision because people have all kinds of ideas about who lives in Jackson Heights willingly, but I saw it coming and I was like, I want to live where I can speak languages, like at least Hindi, right, that other people speak and eat food that is familiar to me. And so that, I think, was for the first 2 years, like I think 2011 to 2013, I lived there, and even now I live in Astoria, but I try to go there. I know the Bangladeshi grocery store in my neighborhood, so like trying to find ways to find people who feel familiar, if not exactly the same. And also I really seek out making other, specifically Indian friends, right? Like I think South Asian friends too, because there's a lot in common in terms of shared histories, but finding other Indian people, keeping in touch with friends that I made there who now live here. And for 2 years I was on the board of which is a queer South Asian organization here. And so that was another way to sort of find the specific narrow intersection of queer people who are South Asian, a lot of whom are immigrants, right, who migrated here and are not second generation. So those are some of the ways, and I think it's a question that I sort of ask myself often. It's like, what is a good way to find a median where I can have some of that here or some of this there.
Are there any other organizations that you've been a part of here in New York doing work that you think is beneficial?
A lot of the work that does, I think still does, is in concert with other organizations. So QWave, which is a queer API organization, and Gapimni, which is another queer API organization that historically used to cater more to men and sort of masculine of center, gender non-conforming folks, but now sort of has taken that out of their, I think, mission. And then also partnered with organizations like the Audre Lorde Project on this annual party called Color Me Queer, which still happens, and it's a like all queer people of color party that happens every year. So I think those are some organizations that do cool work or work that I've liked supporting. I think I don't know as much about the organizations in New York that are doing cool immigration work off the top of my head. Like I know the big ones like Make the Road, right? But I think what I found with in terms of like marrying those identities, I think I'm still looking for the other types of organizations that do that work, because I know they exist.
So you said you moved to New York in 2011?
Yes.
Was it? And Jackson Heights right away?
Yeah.
What was your first day in New York like?
So I moved to Jackson Heights to a house with other queer people of color. So I think it was like I don't know, it's like this heady summer wonder, right? Like it's like, we have a house, which is crazy. I live with people who have the same politics as me, some of whom have similar identities as me. And And then there's like activism happening that I care about and believe in. I think my first weekend in Jackson Heights, I went to Queen's Pride. And it just all, because I just moved from India, so it just all felt like, wow, like I can hold a sign that says I'm against detention, you know, like, and so I think it was amazing because it just put all these people in a place in a moment where it just felt like idealistic and perfect. And I lived there for 2 years, and it wasn't always perfect, right? Like, but I think when I first moved here, I had a job in Union Square. I worked at the same feminist nonprofit I worked at in Delhi. So it felt like this really welcome entry into a professional and personal life that all felt very political and very affirming. You know, yeah.
And so from that point on, when did you move to Astoria?
So I lived in Jackson Heights for 2 years, and then, like a bad New Yorker, I moved upstate for 2 years to go to graduate school. And after that, I moved to Astoria, so in 2015.
So going through this trajectory, this journey,
Right.
and then you come back to New York City, and what was that experience like coming then from upstate New York, culture in upstate New York, which is very different, back to the city? Was there a little bit of a shock, or you're going from kind of two ends of a spectrum dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I ended my relationship with my ex-partner when I was in graduate school, but for part of the time I was sort of coming here very often. And it felt like a given, like, of course I'll come back to New York, right? Like, this feels like purgatory. I'm far away. Everything is crazy and awful. But also, is a weird little town. Like, I mean, it's pretty white, and then there's a lot of students, but it's really progressive. And there's little mom and pop stores, and there's a downtown, and people walk around, right? Like, so I think it was a really fun opposite to New York, like, because I think by the time I left, I was feeling like everybody I know knows each other. They're all dating each other. They all have stories about each other. Like, there's so much like gossip and tension and worry and stress, So, and then there was a lot of, I think I was the only queer person of color in my year, which I was just like, what? Like, everyone I knew leaving here was queer and a person of color, right? I think I had like one white friend maybe. And in grad school, I just felt like I was doing a lot of 101, like, yes, racism, it's real, and not because people are not well-meaning, but I think there's just so many, and also we live in this world. I don't want to, intentions, etc. But so I think it was it was a culture shock in some ways, and in some ways a really welcome one. And actually, by the time I was ready to graduate, I did not want to move back to New York. I was like, I will take a job anywhere. I think I interviewed for some jobs in Albany, and like really like scraping barrel, right? Like, job in the back office, looking at tax forms, talking to no people. And I was like, sure, that sounds fun. And my career counselor was like, hey, there's this job in New York. It sounds really great. You should look into it. And so I moved back sort of unwillingly. I had a horrible time finding an apartment. I didn't have credit history because somehow Americans, their parents set up a credit card for them when they're young. And if you're not American, you just never learn this. I didn't have a credit card the whole time, and so nobody would rent to me. And I just felt very like, why am I trying to move back to New York? But since moving back, I love Astoria. I love my job. And I think the older I get, I'm also starting to stop blaming New York for my problems. Like, I think every few months I'm like, I don't have enough friends, it's the city. Or everything's expensive, it's the city. And then I went to Philly and I was like, I can't do that. And, so I feel like I've gone to the cities that I've flirted with living in and been like, nah, I want to stay. And there's a lot of good and a lot of cool problems to grapple with here, both professionally and, socially.
What would you say to people out there who are looking for ways to get engaged, who don't know the first place to start? If whether it's around issues of immigration or queer politics or any kind of activism or advocacy work. As someone who's so experienced, what advice would you give?
I think I frequently grapple with that same paralysis, right? I feel like there's been times when I've been more active and times when I'm like total inertia. I've not read a thing in days. But I think advice, I think my approach is a little bit pithy and maybe glib, but I think it's to like pick the Facebook fight, right? Like I think we all share space with people who either have abhorrent worldviews or are just choosing that day to share. Like, and I think like all of us, like I think those of us who are not sort of walking the world with so many types of oppression and systemic failures facing us, I think we have a responsibility to pick some Facebook fights, right? Like talk to the people who you don't want to talk to. Don't defriend your high school person who's problematic. Engage with them. And like, sure, it might be like yelling in a vacuum, but we're not going to get anywhere with the small minority of people who believe the same things that we do. And so I think, part of it for me has been letting go of my like shiny radical, like, if they don't say these 4 words, we will not be moving forward in this conversation, to really thinking about meeting people where they're at, right? And also recognizing that so much of the language and framework that I use to navigate the world comes from a really privileged upbringing and access to a lot of resources. And I'm not going to be able to fix anything if I'm me with my inertia and laziness and refusal to have conversations that I don't want to have, right? So I think that's where I would start. For me, honestly, a lot of my like activism came from looking for community, right? It came from looking for people who look like me or thought like me or moved through the world like me. I think my first engagement with was being part of the dance team that was in Manhattan Pride, because I was like, oh my God, queer South Asian people, and so it came very much from that space. And then I think the politics follows sometimes, right? You find people you care about and you realize that the world is really inaccessible to them, sometimes physically and sometimes in other ways, or you find people who are dealing with immigration in a very different way than you had to, and you care about them, and then you feel mobilized.
What would you say to people? What is, what do you want people to know? I'd say 1 about immigration, and 2 about LGBTQ immigration in particular.
I think about immigration, I want to say it's not as flat as one thinks, right? I think the narrative of who immigrates, how they immigrate, why they immigrate, and what their lives are like is a really important one, because it tells the story of so many people. And also, immigrants are all around you, right? Like, I think ignoring this country's like settler colonial history and sort of talking about immigration as if it just appeared is wild, right? And I think somehow we're able to have these parallel conversations about transplants who are also leaving their homes and appearing in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and immigration in very different ways. And sometimes I think we need to engage a little bit closer and think about the ways in which immigrants might not have made it just because you see them on your street, right? Like, and people are, there's that poem, right? People are leaving so much behind, and they're not, like, some are leaving so much behind by choice, and some are, making the choice to live here and some don't have the option. But it's just so much more complicated than we give it credit for. And not everyone needs saving, right? Like, not every immigrant is here hoping that you'll sign the bill. But I hope you sign the bill, Like, I think that we need that too. and you see all the immigrants hanging out together. Maybe they want to hang out together. Like, don't try to diversify, like, kids sitting together. Like, not everything is a tragic story of nobody will be their friend. Like, I'm actively looking for people who look exactly like me to be my friend. And I think about LGBT immigration, I think it's, I think one, just that LGBT communities are thriving and flourishing in so many places, and people are building spaces despite everything else you hear in the news about those countries. And also, LGBT immigration can be sometimes more lonely because you don't find home with all the other immigrants who look like you, right? I think having to look for like immigrant spaces that are also queer affirming is just a dehumanizing work, right? Like, nobody should have to do it. And I think that's, part of the issue, I think, with LGBT immigration or other kinds of sort of marginalized immigration is that we have this like crabs in a barrel mentality about things like immigration, and people who've made it don't want to engage with all of the other nuances that come with making it. And so, yeah, I don't know if I have like a good like LGBT immigration is precisely because I don't think it is any of those things. And I think I feel really lucky to be navigating the world in the way that I am, and also I hate that this is how people have to do it, right? And I hate that I can't have my parents and my community and my work and all like everything in the same little pretty world where borders don't exist. But that's for another day.
Thank you for that. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to talk about, or?
Nothing I can think of.
What would you say, I guess, about what's going on now, like with this administration, with regards to immigration? I think a lot of people, up until maybe a couple of years ago, kind of saw the U.S. as like this beacon of hope and opportunity. Mm-hmm. And do you think that's changed with what's been going on? And maybe could you talk about that, like our current, if you feel comfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I struggle with a little bit is that I think immigration was awful under Obama, right? And so I think in this world where we're now idealizing and romanticizing the people who were less bad, I think we don't remember that, right? We also now are inviting George Bush to come and talk to people in public spaces for money, which I don't get. So I mean, I think that immigration has been fraught for a while, and I think in my experience in a post 9/11 world, I don't know a lot of Arab, South Asian, brown folks who had that beacon of light experience, right? But I also feel like things are worse now. And I think part of what has been really hard about this administration is that I think we're getting hit on so many fronts all the time that it just like puts you in like fight or flight paralysis, right? But if it's not healthcare, it's LGBT policy, and the Supreme Court is now making decisions that who knew they would make? I guess everybody. But I think everything is worse now. Immigration is worse now, right? And I think that I have varying levels of faith in electoral politics, but I am a citizen and I will vote. But also, it's cool if that's not how people think change can be made, right? But I just don't know I can't see in front of the sort of carnage, right? And I don't think that, I didn't feel that way under Obama because I think the comms around immigration policy under Obama was very different. But right now I just feel like it's nonstop, and I don't know how you get up and keep moving, right? And at the same time, I think organizations in Texas are doing the things that make us hear about this work. But yeah, I think it's so terrible, and I totally get that it is worse now, but I don't want to lose sight of, like, we have started in this liminal, like, we're negotiating in very narrow ground what is worse and better, and that terrifies me.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I guess in closing, what do you want people to know about you?
Ooh. That's a big question. I think that wow, I don't know how to answer that. I think I want people to know that I am here, right? And I mean that both in the, like, historical protest sense of, like, we're here and we're not moving, but also in the, like, hey, there's so many of us who haven't figured any of this out, and if you need community, we're making it, right? And if you need people, we're finding them, and there's, for anyone who has all of these narrow, layered identities that I sometimes feel alone in, there's someone else who is navigating those same anxieties and joys here too.
Great. Well, if there's nothing else you'd like to add, I think we can conclude this interview.
All right. Thank you both so much. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.